Corona presents unique challenges. It's a whole different world. So instead of falling and feeling anxieties over it, let's learn how to use how to use the power of Corona in order to grow from it. And that's what we'll explore in this series of Drops from the Well. So we find ourselves in a very unique situation. A few days ago, we were free to go and do as we pleased. And therefore, we were able to go make money and to fend for ourselves. And at least we thought we were in the driver's seat. You could think, right, that you're the one in control. Sure, you've got to trust God, but really there's something you can do. But now Corona's got us stuck, and we don't know what's going to be. And so many businesses have tanked, and so much has fallen apart. And the question really comes about, and now what? Now when I'm stuck, how do you live with yourself when you're stuck? So you say, I must trust God, but I also know that God wants me to do stuff. God wants me to go work and to go do my part. And my hands are bound. I'm tied up. There's nothing I can do because I'm homebound and my business has fallen apart. Let's deal with this question of how do you handle bitachon when the world around you is falling apart? So in the previous drop from the well, we discussed that Joseph was in prison. He's in a dungeon for 12 years. Instead of getting despondent about his situation, he was a man who was able to control the whole Egypt and run it, and was the greatest, holiest, righteous person for the Jewish people ever. And he's stuck and he's confined to a dungeon, and yet instead of falling apart and becoming despondent, he becomes a hero. Because what he realized is that sometimes God wants you to operate this way and sometimes that way. And so looking at himself in a dungeon, he's like, hey, God put me in a dungeon. What does that mean? That means that I should do what the Chovos HaLevavos says, which is rely on God completely. See myself as if I'm in a dungeon. And so he puts himself in that position, and he therefore grows from it. Let's explore further how we do it, because we find ourselves today in a bit of a dungeon with this Corona situation. And if we could shift our thinking and grow from it, we could actually enhance ourselves through the experience. So when you look at Yoseph in the dungeon, he's there for, at that point, 10 years. And one day he meets the butler, interprets the butler's dream, and he tells the butler, you're going to be in front of Paro in 3 days' time. So the butler's like, okay, that's great. Yosef sees a glimmer of hope and opportunity. He tells the butler, could you do me a favor and remind me in front of Paro? Tell him that I'm in prison and save me. That appears to be a simple tactic, a simple technique of hishtadlus, of doing your part. And yet, in the story, as a result of this, the butler forgets Yosef, and for 2 more years, he languishes in the dungeon. Rabbi explains, Rabbi is the 14th century sage and commentator, explains that this was actually a punishment for Yosef because he should have relied on God. And here's the question. What do you mean should have relied on God? God wants a person to do something, and when opportunity presented itself, surely that was what Yosef should have done. What do you expect from people not to do anything? And here's the point we need to take home. In Chassidus, it's explained that there's 2 types of living. There's the regular type of living, which is you live and you trust God, but you also go do stuff. You work and you do your part. And that's most of the time the way we live. But then there are times when we find ourselves in dungeon-like situations. There are times when we just simply don't know what to do. And there's nothing you can do. And you realize how helpless you are. And instead of being helpless, you realize at those times God is calling you to experience more bitachon, more trust in God. So Yosef was the kind of person who was looking for those moments. As he finds himself in the dungeon, he shifted his thinking. And what does he realize? I'm living in an era, in this period of time, in this dungeon, where God wants me to rely on him completely. And so he throws himself at the mercy of God. And in his case, the fact that he was even thinking about the butler and currying favor with him was considered a problem on his part. And that's the message for us. You see, most of the time, God wants us to do our part and to put bitachon, to put trust in God in the back burner. But sometimes there are times, Corona times, where God is calling upon us to put bitachon in the forefront. So when you look around, you say, there's nothing I can do, and you become despondent, and and you feel that anxiety shifted, think to yourself, I'm in God's hands. I always was in God's hands. I just had the lulled sense of false security to think that I wasn't. But that becomes the avoider, that's the work now. When there's nothing you can do, that's exactly what to do. To consider how I can't do anything and how I'm always in God's hands. And that allows us to feel a bliss, so that as soon as we get over this, God willing, we suddenly feel that beautiful bliss of, hey, I'm always in God's hands. I always feel the bitachon of growing from Corona.